delighted to start our second session and really pleased to invite David Rickard to the stage. David is with the Knowledge Group and is going to be talking us through the reality of outcome-based pricing. So over to you, David.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kerry. I did joke on LinkedIn recently that I was in a conference with NICE, the CCaaS provider in Vegas a couple of years ago, and actually it opened for Nicole Kidman, and actually I did. So she was the guest speaker that they had, and I was on right before her, and now I'm opening for Billy Ocean, so I'm starting to feel like I've got some credibility here with this. So thank you for having me today. So my name's David Rickard. I now work at the Knowledge Group. I've been there 4 weeks, so it's a brand new gig for me. But really pleased to join the Knowledge Group. Great bunch of people that I'm working with. My colleague Joel, who actually is embarrassingly filming me, is also there. So if you want to speak to anyone from the Knowledge Group, please grab us. But my role is I lead all of our advisory services business. And so we are an advisory firm, sourcing and procurement advisory firm. We work with both providers to help them to win better and win more. Not by bringing them leads, but by helping them to actually be better at winning, but also work heavily with the buyer side, the buyer community. TKG are built by practitioners, so Joel, myself, many of the other leaders within the business have all been on the buyer side. My own background is that prior to joining TKG, I spent 5 years at Everest Group, so the research firm, researching mainly into BPO, CX as being the area that I focus most on. I'd had spell at consulting before that, but I also spent 17 years in procurement at Microsoft. So I'd been a long time working on BPO outsourcing, CX outsourcing, marketing, F&A, all the different sorts of BPO services that are out there. So try to bring a real practitioner's lens to a lot of the work that we do at TKG. So I've been asked today to talk about outcome-based pricing. And the question is, are they really happening? And what do they look like? So hopefully you can see that. Are outcome-based contracts really happening? And I think the answer is yes. It's also no. And it's also, it depends on who you speak to. I have a fairly coarse analogy, but I think we're all adults in the room, so I think I can share it. When I talk about outcome-based pricing, I say it's a little bit like teenagers talking about sex. So again, a little bit base, but bear with me. Because when we talk about outcome-based pricing, everyone is saying they're doing it. Only a few percentage of people are, and those that are doing it badly. So that's why outcome-based pricing is actually a little bit like teenagers having sex. So that wasn't particularly professional, but actually I think is true and one of the best ways that I think of describing it. So what we're seeing is that there is a lot of talk. Kerry's asked me to talk today about it. There's a lot of buzz around outcome-based prices, and just to set expectations, I'm predominantly talking about service-based contracts, not IT-based contracts, not when you're buying software. So thinking about it from a services perspective. But what's really happening? So here's what we see from the market, and this is both our experience at TKG, my experience from Everest Group, but also other research firms. I know ISG are in the room. I've got some examples from HFS here. But what we see is when you think about true outcome-based models, we would say that less than 10% of services deals in the market are true outcome-based models. I would say probably it's 5 to 8% in BPO, and CX, where I've done a lot of my work in my career, I would say it's less than 3 to 6%. I think the data we had at Everest Group showed that probably 7% of deals for CX are in a true outcome-based model. And I think even those are fairly inflated a little bit and also are highly dominated in the sales space, because sales obviously sits within CX, and I think that a lot of the outcome-based models we see are sitting in sales. The HFS research shows that it's less than 5% of deals are outcome-based, despite the fact that 76% of organizations say they actually want it, but they're not getting there. When we think about it in terms of an outcome component though, we do see about 25 to 33% of deals do have an outcome component in the contract. But what we tend to see that those tend to be mainly among large strategic contracts, whereas 300 plus FTE and it's an exec sponsored role. There is very few examples of where it's the smaller deals where we're really getting into true outcome-based models. And that is presenting to be a challenge. And then the majority are still predominantly input based, so FTE, per hour, per transaction pricing, with no outcome layer at all. So what we can see is, despite the hype, and we've been talking about outcome-based models for 15 years, 20 years, probably ever since that we've all been starting in this industry, but we're not necessarily seeing a real movement. When we do see some movement, or when we do see there as an outcome component though, what does it look like? Well, what you can see there is the data shows that even when there is an outcome-based component, 85% is still base fee. So it's still predominantly around effort-based. I know we were talking, the gentleman Carl from Monzo was talking about outcome-based, and I'd love to hear more about from what they're doing in terms of true outcome-based models. I was talking to a service provider yesterday who are doing a lot in the outcome-based space, again, a developing area. So I think we'll build more and more case studies and research into this area. But right now, it looks like most of it is just a base fee. There is a small proportion, 15%, which is at an at-risk pool. And then there's about a 5% uncapped upside that is included in the contract. But what you can see there is even on these deals that are probably being called outcome-based, and the reason at the beginning when I joked about it depends, is because what we saw is a lot of times people are being pushed to do outcome-based pricing by the CFO or the CEO because they've heard that it's a good thing to do. They push the procurement team to do it. So what they do is they end up having this famous hybrid model. And again, the data that we've had in the past has showed that probably 70% of deals are in this hybrid model, which is really truly just an input-based model with a little bit of upside included, but they're desperately calling it an outcome-based model. So what we really see is that those outcome-based models aren't necessarily getting there yet from a services perspective. And just adding a little bit more sort of real-world experience, which again, the thing at TKG we really pride ourselves on is that real-world experience that we bring to play. When we've looked at the last 6 deals that we've done, we've tried to drive outcome-based contract discussions in all of those deals, but none of them have materialized to a true outcome-based model. And I'll talk about some of the reasons why in a moment. But what we've seen is that there's an appetite to start at the front. Advisors, practitioners like us are really keen to have that discussion because we think there is value to drive from having outcome-based models, because I think it adds value for both the buyer and the provider. But you get into the weeds, you get into the realities of the world, and it doesn't happen. And what we've seen is that it's buyer resistance, or it's buyer fear, it's other teams get involved, whether it's legal, finance, they make it difficult to do, and therefore it doesn't progress any further. So what we've seen is that most of the deals end up having effort-based core pricing and an SA linked to bonus malus or service credit overlay, but not a true outcome-based model. When we talk about what makes it difficult, I want you to think about this in a different way though. So I'm calling out the problems. I think for this audience, we should be thinking about how do we then tackle these proactively. So if you look at each of these in turn, these are the things I think if you're thinking about doing true outcome-based models, how can you do things differently, or how can you start preparing now? I think the first thing is around baseline. So you can't pay on an outcome if you haven't got a strong baseline of where you're starting from. And I think that's one of the challenges that we see is people don't really know where they're starting from. And then how do you really then build upon that to have a true outcome-based model? So I think you really need to have a strong understanding of your baseline. And that's something that can be done now ahead of trying to build in these mythical outcome-based models. But starting to think about that as leaders of the business now, how do you really think about the outcomes that you're trying to drive? The next one that's really difficult is attribution. So the biggest challenge that we found, and again, my days at Microsoft, I tried to do something with Xbox where we were only going to pay for resolved cases. The problem was that we really found it hard to attribute who's driving that resolution. And if there's an outage caused by the Xbox server, for example, the provider's going to get hit by volume. Is it their fault? And then if we fix the server, who do we pay? So it's really hard. So you have to think about how do you really think about attribution. So if you're going to be paying on outcomes, you're only paying for the outcomes that have really been driven by that service provider and not by something that you've invested to do yourself. Governance is not always the sexiest word, but it's really important to think about how you're going to manage this process. I think that when I've seen outcome-based models be tried about 5-7 years ago, there was so much governance being put around it, it was going to cost us more than what we were going to save, and actually your outcomes weren't necessarily going to give that business benefit. So you need to think about the right governance model, but the governance model needs to be in the way that doesn't just become an extra layer of bureaucracy and pain for the service provider or you as the buying organisation, how do you really drive governance into that model? You also have to think about external factor carve-outs. So what I mean by that is there are things that are going to happen that are beyond your control and beyond the service provider's control. How do you accommodate that in the model? So if you've got a true outcome-based model and you're only paying the provider if they achieve certain outcomes, then how are you going to factor in for things that could happen? Whether it's weather events of a particular type of travel business or something that actually the provider has no control over, but nor do you, you can't have a model that is unfair on either party. So how do you factor those into the contract? And that's where it really becomes tricky from a legal perspective. I think timing. So timing is really important because a lot of people think, and I've got a myth buster in a minute, no, Kerry said you wanted to do some myth busting, but the timing issue is where people think you have to have it from day one. I think a lot of the time you need more time to evolve in a contract before you can go into outcome-based models. So sometimes it's we will get there, but let's get to know each other, let's understand the data, let's understand the business more before you can move into that true outcome-based model. And then lastly, it's around maturity. So I think that what we've seen is that the best outcome-based models where they are happening is that there is an established buyer relationship with the provider, but the buyer is also relatively mature. I think sometimes if you're more of an immature buyer, it's really hard to then start going straight into an outcome-based model where you're actually then expecting to be able to manage that in an established way. A lot of time also we're seeing challenges from a maturity perspective that if you're in a multi-sourced environment, how do you really do true outcome-based? Because you want to have a model that's consistent across your multiple providers. Sometimes it's not able to do that. So I think there's a whole host of things that you have to think about as you think about what will make it difficult. And what I want to say is that this slide looks like we're calling on the negatives. Please turn those into opportunities to think about what do we need to be working on now. And I think by working on all of them now, you can be better prepared. So understanding that the baseline, how you attribute it, starting to think about that in terms of governance, the external factors and what could impact the deals that you have, when you're going to do it and how mature is that relationship. Because it might be also that you choose certain particular places to really focus on outcome-based, but others are too immature, so therefore you decide not to do it. So really thinking about these factors as calls to action, not another reason not to do it. So I probably should have given it a better title really, but it is what makes it difficult, but that doesn't mean that you can't fix it by being proactive. When we see there are some outcome-based contracts, there are things that are being measured, and people always say, what are the outcomes? So what we see is that if you think about it from a CX contact center perspective, cross-sell, upsell conversion, all of that stuff is easy to manage. And that's why I think we see on the CX side, probably that 5, 6, 7% of outcome-based is predominantly on the sales side of the business because they're easier outcomes to attribute. But I think you also can look at churn, retention rate, cost per resolution, containment rate, CSAT, NPS. There's other outcomes that you can try to manage, but I think it's really important to be thinking about what are the outcomes you want to drive as a business. I think that's the other thing that people often underestimate, which is they think they can just turn their existing KPIs into an outcome. But what's the true outcome you want to drive? Because that's the thing that you have to think about is what's the true outcome you want to drive as a business, because you don't want to incentivize the wrong behavior. When we've looked at healthcare BPO, things like claims denial rates or member satisfaction scores, there are other outcomes that can be used. So the outcomes are going to be different also depending on the business you're coming from. If we think about procurement sourcing, when we've seen outsourced deals on there, what we're seeing is that things like fees tied directly to committed savings. So we're seeing in terms of procurement outsourcing, there are outcome-based deals are being done there, really looking at how effective procurement is being. I mentioned the myth. So really the myth is outcome-based contracts happen at signature. They don't, or they probably won't, or maybe even they shouldn't. You need to have time to really establish that credibility, that relationship with the service provider. Yes, they can happen at signature if it's a renewal or a deal that's evolved. But if you're thinking about a brand new deal, actually it's probably too risky for the service provider, and have they added in a lot of risk, like hedge their bets a lot from a risk perspective if you're trying to do it from day one. And it's probably too risky from you as well, because again, you don't necessarily understand everything about the complexity of that deal. So we've seen that actually that is an area to think about, really thinking about doing it at the right time and not thinking you have to do it from day one. So in summary, I've just tried to pull a lot of the information together that we've seen, but what I would say is, if I was leaving with anything, is one, go back to those 6 difficulties and tackle those as opportunities to start preparing. What we've seen is that there is a shift to outcome-based models. If we just measured conversations, there would be a massive shift. If we actually measure actual achievements of it, it's slower. But there is definitely early discussions, more traction, more and more service providers willing to do it. A lot of the time, a lot of service providers, without being negative, will say they're open to do it at the sales stage, but doesn't necessarily move through into fruition when you actually try and strike a deal. So really going into that, but that's also about building trust with your service provider, having clarity on what your requirements are going to be, how you're going to measure, all the things that we talked about as difficulties. If you can go into negotiations being clear about those 6 things, then actually it should make it easier to do. I think the hybrid structure is the most dominant real-world pattern, so not that real pure outcome-based. I think, as I said earlier, baseline setting and attribution, not the target itself, is where you're actually going to be able to succeed or fail. So the target is almost irrelative or irrelevant if you haven't got the attribution, the governance, and the baseline setting behind it. Because you need to know where you're starting to know whether the outcomes are being achieved. You need to be able to govern it, and you really need to be able to sort of attribute who drove that to be able to feel comfortable that you're not paying for something that the provider has not earned. And it doesn't have to be from day one. So trust in the outcome-based model takes time. It takes time to build it on the relationship. And I think you need to have spent that time to really establish the credibility in the model or understanding the business to be able to move into it. So that's all I had to cover. I wanted to get us back on time a little bit as well. So I've sort of sped up a little bit to get us back on time. But I'm around all day. But if there are any questions, maybe I have time for one question. But if you've got any questions, happy to take them. But I'm around all day.
I've usually got a loud enough voice to get to the back of the room anyway. But firstly, I think everything you've said chimes with our experience. So I'm from DLA Piper, we're a law firm, but certainly everything you've said chimes with our experience in terms of how these deals are being negotiated in practice. So fully endorse all of that. And I guess there's got 2 points, and we'll just be interested in getting your views on it. Firstly, just to stress the need for these to interface with the other aspects of the contract, which may go to the same end. So innovation funds, gain sharing, committed savings from day one, they all obviously need to be balanced out. But then the other point that I would just, again, be interested about your experience is the other aspect beyond just the attribution difficulties, which is the consequences upon behaviours. So to give you the real anecdote, we did a procurement outsource, which had a large element of outcome-based pricing, which was focused, not surprisingly, upon cost savings. And what we found that was then the outsourced function, who previously had handled a lot of the contract negotiation, been very robust in terms of adherence to policies and service level regimes, kind of just gave all that away because they were purely now being driven by their new lords and masters towards the outcome, which was going to result in the financial benefit. So all of a sudden, the poor legal team, who obviously were my closest contacts, were swamped with a whole lot of work, which previously that outsourced function used to do, purely because that's what the outcome was driving. So interested about you, whether you've seen something similar.
I am just curious about the transition period. So if you have an FTE-based charging model, you want to move to an outcome-based, what are some of those factors to think to? You know, is it a simple switch on, or are there kind of a ramp up to get you to that outcome-based?
I mean, I would say, and this is a horrible answer, and I really apologise, it depends, right? And the reason I say that, and I always smile because it's just our typical analyst or typical advisor answer there, is because it depends on where you're coming from, the size of the deal that you're talking about, how confident are you in the data. I would say I wouldn't ever want to do it just to switch overnight. I think that you need to have a dual run period. That run period could be a month, it could be 3 months, it could be 6 months. I would say that you need a dual run period to be able to see actually the outcomes we think we're driving, are we actually driving them, and actually are we staying within the cost guidelines and the sort of the cost parameters that we're going to have to set for ourselves. Because what you don't want to do is go to an outcome-based model and suddenly feel that you've spent the budget within 3 months for a 6-month project. So I would say always needs to be a dual run period where possible, but it will depend on the size and the complexity, and also how much data you have, how much confidence you have in the data, and where you're coming from. So happy to talk more, but yeah, there's not one simple answer to that, I don't think. Just a question over there. Yeah, I mean, I definitely have seen The unintended consequences issue, I think, has been around though for a long time, right? I think that I've got another example that with Xbox where we tried to push up first contact resolution and we found everyone was just given free controllers away and it cost the business millions, if not billions, because that was the focus became on FCR. And it was like, well, the way to resolve it quickly is not wait for the controller to come back, it's just send a new one out. So I think that unintended consequences is a big issue in outcome-based contracts. And I think that's where really skilled procurement people and advisors can help in terms of thinking through what are those unintended consequences you have to plan for, so you can then say, okay, what if this happens? I think you have to do a lot of what if scenario planning to say, okay, this is the outcome we want to drive. Is it truly the outcome we want to drive? And if we drive that outcome, what's the knock-on effect to other parts of the business? And then, so that's where the real skill comes, is to be able to understand the business. And that's why I think it's really important that it's driven by people who understand your business to say, yeah, it's easy to say, let's just do this as an outcome. But then if that actually happens, what does it do to that team and that department and really be able to think through those unintended consequences? So yes, I think unintended consequences are definitely an issue. I think they've always been an issue when you try and change parameters or drive different business performance. I don't think they're any worse than an outcome-based model, but they have to really be factored in.
I think David deserves a really, really loud round of applause.